Okay, welcome everyone. The United Nations General Assembly designated January 27, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It is our responsibility to talk about Holocaust. We as a generation must learn never to be silent when human rights are ignored. We must learn to speak out against what we think is wrong. We must be involved. We must teach tolerance, especially now. There are lessons of Holocaust and they are still relevant today, especially today. And I would like to present our speaker, Shelley Greenspan. Shelley is a daughter of two Holocaust survivors from Transylvania, the present-day Romania. She grew up in the Bronx, New Jersey, and Israel. She has lived in Westchester since 1993 and has two grown daughters. She lives with her husband in Irvington, New York. Shelley is a member of the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, New York, hhrecny.org, and I will put this link in the chat in a minute. The mission of this organization is to enhance the teaching and learning of the Holocaust and the rights of all people to be treated with dignity and respect. Please welcome Shelley Greenspan.
Well, thank you, Galina, and thank you, Giovanna. Thank you to the Harrison Public Library and to the Harrison JCC for giving me this opportunity tonight to tell you about my mother's life story before, after, and during the Holocaust. As Galina said, tomorrow is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. 77 years ago, on January 27, 1945, the most notorious of all of Hitler's concentration camps, Auschwitz, was liberated. The purpose of International Holocaust Remembrance Day is to honor the victims of the Nazis, to support the development of education programs to remember the Holocaust, and to prevent further genocide. Its purpose is also to combat denial and distortion of the Holocaust. As Israel's ambassador to the UN recently said, although the atrocities committed by the Nazis have been highly documented, sadly, we now live in an era in which fiction is now becoming fact and the Holocaust is becoming a distant memory. So I'm here tonight to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive by bearing witness to my family's story. As Hungarian Jews, both sides of my family, my father's side and my mother's side, were deported to Auschwitz and would experience its unspeakable horrors. I will focus tonight on my mother's story and her family. My mother, Lilly, was not only imprisoned in Auschwitz, but she would also be deported to a second concentration camp. During her imprisonment, she lived through starvation, forced labor, beatings, terrible physical and emotional cruelty. But she went on not only to survive, but to thrive, as you can see in this picture taken just a few years before she passed away. My mother, Lilly, was a warm, caring woman whose greatest pleasure was her family and friends. She would shower you with affection and feed you her delicious Hungarian Jewish cooking to show her love. She had a smile that would light up the room and loved a reason to celebrate, especially at family gatherings like in this photo, which was taken at a family Bat Mitzvah in Indianapolis. How could she have gone through the horrors of the Holocaust and still exhibit so much joy and love of life? I think the answer lies in three important things. My mother had love, hope, and someone to lean on throughout her ordeal. Lilly was very fortunate to have her older sister, Sarah, by her side. It was her love and support that gave Lilly the strength not to give in to despair and to hold on to hope that someday, some way, their hellish nightmare would end and that they could return home. Lilly grew up in the small village of Borsato in Northern Transylvania in present-day Romania. The area is quite beautiful, as you can see, with the Carpathian Mountains surrounding it, lots of forests, and a river running through it. She lived in her grandfather's house. Her grandfather was a well-to-do man who owned a dairy farm, a vinegar factory, and a general store. Lily's father, on the other hand, came from a poor family, but he was welcomed warmly as a son-in-law because he was very kind and very learned, and this was just as important as having money to the family. Their home was a lively place with 6 children running around and a very welcoming one. Father would often bring travelers to their home for a Sabbath meal. Friday night Sabbath dinners were very warm and special for the family. The table would be laid with their best white linen tablecloth, candles would be lit, a delicious meal would be served. When I was young, I would watch my mother light the Sabbath candles and say the blessing over them silently while she closed her eyes in prayer. She seemed to go very far away for a moment. And then just like that, she would be present again with us, smiling and serving up such delicacies as chopped liver, chicken soup, and roast chicken. The house is still standing, and it's the town's post office on the main street. So there are 2 photos of the house, one taken in 1972 when my mother went to visit on the left, and one from May of 2019 when I was fortunate enough to go and visit Romania with my oldest daughter, Emily. Now, unfortunately, I was very excited to see the house and go inside, and we started looking around the post office, and our tour guide, who was just lovely, she knew a lot about architecture and about the past history of the Jews in Romania, and she was pointing out certain features of the house that were original. And we wanted to take photos and look around, do a little exploring. And she addressed the post office, the postmistress, if you will, and told her in Romanian, of course, that we had come from a long ways away, that the house was very important and special to us and sentimental. And could we look around, perhaps in the back, maybe take some photos? And unfortunately, this woman looked us up and down and kind of disdainfully, and she said, "No, not permitted, sorry." So we were crushed. We were very disappointed. And Alina said that she was disappointed, but she wasn't all that surprised, because she said that sometimes the attitude of the townspeople when Jewish people who used to live there come back to visit, they're very suspicious and hostile, as if, we're coming to reclaim our property or something. Now, obviously, we weren't, going to lay any claim to the house, or, which was now the post office. We merely, wanted to have a look around and document it for the rest of the family. But she was not extending any hospitality to us. So what could we do? We had to leave. But then something happened that turned the experience around a little bit for us, because as we walked out and passed the house, we saw a gate, and there were 2 women standing behind the gate. And our tour guide was so smart. She told them what had happened, and they were outraged on our behalf. They just, "What do you mean she wouldn't let you take photos? That's terrible." They said, "We're going to unlock the gate. You come in the back. At least you could get a look at the house from the back. It'll give you more of an idea." And so they opened the gate, and this is what we saw. And it just, it just made me happy, because first of all, it was beautiful back there. And I could picture, all the stories my mother would tell me of her siblings and her running around. I could picture, the cows and the horses back there. And my mother always told me, when I was a child, that she could see the Carpathian Mountains from her bedroom window. And I didn't really believe her. I thought she was probably exaggerating, maybe there was a hill or something. I didn't know what to believe. But sure enough, you could see those Carpathian Mountains on the right side of the picture. And so that, that was very special for me. And, the ground smelled good. And I don't know, I felt a real connection somehow. And, in Romania, we met people who were open and wonderful, like the women that led us in the back. And we met people like the postmistress who weren't so nice. And, I guess it's like people everywhere, some good and some not so nice. So I will introduce you to the family. These are on top are, this is my mother, Lilly, her parents, Nelly and Eliezer Meyer. And in age order, starting from the left, her oldest brother, Joseph. And Joseph was very quiet and serious-minded. Then comes Sister Sarah. She was the oldest sister in the family, and she was in many ways the star of the family. She was beautiful. She was intelligent. She believed in tikkun olam, which means repairing the world. She had a real sense of social justice. And so much so that she landed in jail once for participating in anti-fascist activities. Luckily, her father had the means to bail her out. Next comes Bill. Now, Bill and Lilly were closest to one another in age and in temperament. Unlike Joseph and Sarah, they didn't care too much for school. They preferred to play with their friends and their family pets. And they both loved a good practical joke. And my Aunt Terry told me a couple of pranks that Bill played, and they both took place in the synagogue, as it were. Now, every Friday night, it was a religious family. Every Friday night is the Sabbath, and father and the boys would go to synagogue. And Bill just couldn't quite sit still during the service. And he thought to himself, how could I amuse myself? Now, the town of Borsato was a rural town with unpaved roads, so there's lots of mud. So the men would walk to synagogue. You couldn't take any transportation. You're not supposed to take transportation on the Sabbath. So they would walk with their boots, which would get rather muddy. So they would remove the boots and put them in the entranceway. And then they had slippers that they would put on to go into the sanctuary for prayer. So what does Bill do? While they were all praying, he sneaks out and he hides the men's boots. So when they get out, they could have sworn they put their boots in a certain place, and where are the boots? The boots are not to be found. So that was one thing he did. And another thing he did, also, while the men were praying, the men would wear these prayer shawls called talises. And these prayer shawls had long fringes on them on either side. And the men were sort of, sitting closely together. So he would sneak behind them and he would tie the fringes of the talises one to another so that when they got up, they were kind of all bound together. And his father, Eliezer Meyer, he pretended to scold him to sort of save face with the neighbors, but he actually found the pranks kind of funny himself. And Bill was so charming that he was one of those kids that could just get away with stuff. You just had to laugh at him. He was that kind of character. Now, my mother had pranks of her own. Hers took place on home turf. Now, they lived out in the country on a farm, but they had relatives that came from the cities, and they would go to visit, their country cousins. And these city slickers, they didn't know a cow from a horse. So one day, her cousin Lilly, also named Lilly, came over, and my mother, Lilly, told her, "Oh, you see that animal over there? That's the horse. Why don't you try to ride it?" But of course, it was the cow. And poor cousin Lilly tried to get on the cow, and boy, was that cow annoyed. It started kicking like mad, almost missing her head. Thank God nothing terrible happened. But that was one story my mother told me. And then she told me another story. My mother was always a little bit jealous of her older sister, Sarah. Why? Because her mom was always comparing her unfavorably with Sarah. She would say, "Why can't you be more like Sarah? Why can't you be better in school and more serious and studious?" And to make matters worse, she had to wear Sarah's hand-me-down clothes. Oh boy, did my mother resent that, because my mother was always a fashion plate, even from a young age. So one day she decided to take matters into her own hands. Now, Nelly was a generous woman. she would often give to those less fortunate. So she would often send her kids out with big baskets of food and provisions to give to the neighbors. And Lilly took an opportunity one day when Nelly sent her out. She took all her hand-me-down clothes, put them at the bottom of the basket along with the food, and dropped off the basket with the food and the clothes to the neighbors. Now, the next day, all the kids were getting ready for school, but Lilly wasn't getting dressed. And Nelly said, "Why aren't you getting dressed, Lilly? You're going to be late." And she said, "Mom, I have nothing to wear." She said, "What do you mean you have nothing to wear? You have a closet full of clothes. Come on now." She says, "No, look." And she opened her drawers and the cupboards were bare. She said, "Lilly, what did you do with all your clothes?" She said, "Well, Mom, I gave it to the neighbors." "You did what?" "Yes, you taught me that it's good to be charitable, right? So when I gave them the food, I thought they could use the clothes too." Well, Nelly was plenty annoyed, but Lilly got her own way and she had clothes made just for her. Now, when my mother told me these stories decades later, she would still get such a kick out of them. She would laugh out loud. She would kind of slap her thigh. She was very pleased with herself for pulling those pranks. Now, Lilly had a younger brother and a younger sister, Yehuda and Blima, but unfortunately, I don't have any photos of them. So Lilly and her family didn't experience a lot of day-to-day anti-Semitism in their hometown, with one notable exception. In 1930, when Lilly was just 3 years old, an anti-Semitic fascist mob set fire to over 100 Jewish homes in her town of Borsato. Luckily, her family's home was spared. Now, my mother never told me that story directly. I only learned about it when she gave testimony for the Steven Spielberg Shoah Foundation. And after I heard her tape, I asked her about it, and she said, yes, that did happen. But she preferred to tell me the happier stories of her childhood before the war. So the family had a pretty good life. But everything changed for Lilly's family and the Jews of Borsato in August of 1940, when Lilly was 13 years old. Northern Transylvania in Romania was taken over by Hungary, who were allied with the Nazis. Borsato was included in this land transfer. And this yellow area is the part of Romania that's Northern Transylvania that was annexed by Hungary in August of 1940, with the blessing and with the demands of the Nazis. Actually, Borsato is very close to Marmaros Sighet right here. So this area had, in fact, been part of Hungary before World War I. When Hungary lost World War I, they had to cede a lot of their territory. And now, thanks to their alliance with Hitler, they were regaining a lot of territory that they had lost. So at first, the Jews of Northern Transylvania were not alarmed to rejoin Hungary after 20 years of being part of Romania. After all, they had experienced anti-Semitism under Romania, and many Transylvanian Jews fought in World War I to defend Hungary, and they had some remaining loyalty. However, they were very disillusioned when they fell under Hungary's severe anti-Jewish laws. These laws banned Jews from working in many of their professions and businesses. Many now had no way to earn a living. Jewish children were now banned from attending secular school, so my mother's formal education ended at age 13. Additionally, Jewish businesses that were still allowed to remain open were forced to stay open on the Sabbath, a day when religious Jews should do no work. Now, grandfather and father, they were religious, observant Jews. They refused, so their general store was shut down. Luckily, they had the farm and they had the means to keep going economically. A lot of other families weren't so fortunate. Racial laws were also passed in Hungary, similar to those that had been passed earlier in Germany, as how a Jew is defined. Marriage between a Jew and non-Jew was banned. Even dating a Jew could land a non-Jew in jail. Jews were seen as a lesser race, and to mingle would be to pollute the dominant Hungarian population. To make matters worse, Lilly's house was one of the largest in town, and one day a group of Hungarian soldiers knocked on the door demanding lodging. And the family, of course, could not refuse this. Lilly's home, which before had been so warm and joyful, was now made into a kind of prison where the family was made to feel unwelcome in their own home. Hungary had established something called the Hungarian labor service system. This was for so-called undesirable men to do military service. These undesirables, who were they? Mainly Jewish men. The men were given no arms and uniforms and had to do the most dangerous and backbreaking work, like digging trenches, repairing rail tracks and roads, and even clearing minefields. Many Hungarian Jewish men would die of disease, starvation, and physical abuse in forced labor. Brother Joseph, around this time, left home because he was called up to this forced labor. With things getting worse and worse for the Jews, the Romanian households who worked for Lilly's mother offered to hide the children up in the mountains to keep them safe. Lilly's parents and grandfather didn't know what to do. It was a very tough decision to, leave your children not with strangers, but, to separate yourselves from them. So in the end, they decided that it would be better if they would all stay together. But the family would come to deeply regret this decision. In early 1944, Hungary saw that the direction of the war had turned and the Axis powers would lose the war, and they secretly tried to get out of their alliance with Germany. The Germans got wind of this, unfortunately, and in March of 1944, they occupied Hungary. Hitler's hatred of the Jews was such that even though Germany was losing the war, it was more important to him to spend his dwindling resources on mobilizing to murder every Jew in Europe he could get his hands on. He may not have been able to win the war against the Russians and the Allied powers, but he felt he could still win the war against the Jews. The Hungarian Jews would be the last population of European Jews to be selected for mass extermination. Working together with the Hungarian police, military, and other officials, they forced the Jewish population from their homes and concentrated them into ghettos. In April of 1944, shortly after Lilly's 17th birthday, her family and all the Jews in town evacuated Borsato and went to a neighboring town of Vishu de Sus. That was where the nearest Jewish ghetto was established. The town was chosen because it already had a large Jewish population, and more importantly, it sat at a railroad station. Her brother Joseph didn't go to the ghetto because, as I said, he was called up to forced labor. Also, Lilly's grandmother had passed away some time earlier of cancer. But Lilly, her grandfather, her mother and father, and 4 of her siblings found shelter in the town of Vishu de Sus with some cousins who happened to live within the ghetto walls. Now, it wasn't enough that the Jews had to go live in the ghetto. They weren't guaranteed housing in the ghetto. They had to sort of squeeze in with other families, and it was very tight. So one little bit of good luck that they had was that they already knew family members in the town, so they were able to at least squeeze in with people that they knew and loved. Now, conditions in the ghetto, as you can imagine, were quite grim. Food and medicine were scarce. The Hungarian authorities had stripped the Jews of anything of value when they were forced from their homes and were beaten even in the ghetto if the guards suspected that they were still hiding some valuables. So they had little to barter with or pay for food with. Keeping clean was a luxury. They were so cramped they barely had room to stretch out and sleep at night. Amazingly, even though they were subject to quite a shakedown by the Hungarians, one thing survived, and that is my grandmother's Nelly's ring. It has her initials, Nelly Davidowitz, ND, on it. And I don't know if you can see, but I'm wearing the ring tonight. It's really the only thing I have from the family from before the war that remains. Now I'm thinking that they must have somehow hidden the ring in the garden behind the house, kind of miraculously that it survived, because it's the only thing that did. So they would stay in the ghetto for only 1 month because the Russian army was advancing. The Germans had no time to waste, so they sped up the process of deportation of the Jews to Auschwitz. In May of 1944, transports from the ghetto in Vishu and other parts of Hungary began. A few months later, the area would be liberated by the Russians, but it was a few months too late for Lilly and her family. 8 of my family members, my great-grandfather Moshe, my grandmother Nelly, my grandfather Eliezer Meyer, my mother Lilly, my aunt Sarah, my uncle Bill, my uncle Yehuda, my aunt Lima, they were forced onto freight trains, standing shoulder to shoulder as the doors slammed shut. For 2 brutal days, they traveled like that with little food or water and no privacy, even to relieve themselves. When the train finally stopped at Auschwitz, they were ordered to get out fast. Nazi guards shined flashlights in their eyes, and German shepherds strained at their leashes, ready to pounce. The men were immediately separated from the women and children. The women were further separated into 2 lines, one on the left and one on the right. My mother Lilly and her mother Nelly and her sister Sarah were ordered to go to the right. Now, my mother was 17 at the time, and Sarah was 21. But Yehuda and Lima, who were only 15 and 13 at the time, were ordered to go to the left. Now, Nelly, being the good mother that she was, she couldn't bear to leave her 2 youngest alone, so she crossed over to the left line to be with them. My mother tried to do the same, but it was Sarah's quick thinking. She pulled her back. She said, "No, you're going to stay with me." It was the first time, but not the last time, that Sarah was going to save my mother's life. Sarah could see that those on the left were mothers with young babies in their arms, younger children, elderly people, sickly looking people. So she knew that they didn't want to be on the left line. So it was May 24th, 1944, the same day they arrived at Auschwitz. Lily's grandfather Moshe, her mother Nelly, and her younger brother and sister Yehuda and Lima were put to death in the gas chambers. Of the 1.1 million Jewish prisoners at Auschwitz, the Jews of Hungary made up the largest percentage by country, 430,000. Of that population, 80% were murdered upon arrival. I went to visit Auschwitz in May of 2019 and lit these memorial candles almost 75 years to the day of the murder of my relatives, and was finally able to say Kaddish, the memorial prayer over their lives. So Lily and Sarah were together. They would remain together. By the way, these photos were taken well after the war, of course. But I'm just giving you a visual of the 2 of them. So they were stripped of all their belongings and clothing, and they were given raggedy striped uniforms to wear and wooden clogs for their feet. And they were forced to line up at attention twice a day, each morning and each evening, for something called appel, which was roll call. And they had to stand there, standing perfectly still and silent, sometimes for hours, while they were counted and examined. Here another selection was made. those who looked sickly or perhaps were talking when they should have remained silent, or for whatever reason, you could be taken off the roll call and never seen or heard from again. Sarah made sure that she would pinch Lily's cheeks for color so she looked healthy, and that she stood perfectly still throughout Appel. And they breathed a sigh of relief each time Appel was over and they were not taken off. 1 month after they arrived in Auschwitz, they were again boarded onto freight train, this time bound for another concentration camp in the north of Poland called Stutthof. My mother was put to work in a grenade factory, as many of the prisoners at labor camps were forced to support the German war effort. Her job was to fill the grenades with explosive powder. The chemicals burned her throat and turned her skin a sickly shade of blue. Sarah, meanwhile, figured out that if she volunteered at the camp's hospital, she could get a little bit extra rations. So that's what she did. Now, this was critical because the prisoners were only fed a few thin slices of bread and watery soup. That was their diet, and they were made to work long, hard hours on a starvation diet. So Sarah would greet Lily at night in the barracks. They both went off to their jobs during the day. They would come back to the barracks exhausted at night. But Sarah always had a little something extra from my mother. And Sarah would even say sometimes, "Oh, I'm not very hungry. Why don't you eat a little more?" She really looked after my mother. Now, the days stretched into weeks and then into months with the same routine. Hard work, exhaustion, fear, and hunger were their daily lives. Still, Lily had Sarah's support, and Sarah had a mission to keep Lily alive. So they leaned on each other and tried their best to get through each day without giving into despair. Lily and Sarah were interned at Stutthof for 5 months, from August 1944 until January 1945, when the Germans evacuated the camp to flee the advancing Russian army. Her entire unit of women prisoners were forced to march into brutally frigid conditions in their threadbare uniforms and inadequate shoes, some even shoeless. Those who were too weak to go on were shot on the spot. Some just almost froze to death in place. It was so bitterly cold. So they marched like that for 2 long days. By the second night, Sarah noticed lights from a distant farmhouse. She knew if they continued marching in these conditions, they had little chance of survival. So she decided they should try to make a break for it. They would have not much to lose. So they did. They broke off the line, ran into the farmhouse, and slept in the hayloft. The next day, when the woman of the house came to the barn to feed the animals, Sarah presented herself. She persuaded the woman that she should help them and give them food and lodging because the Russians were coming, and surely the woman would be rewarded for helping them. The lady agreed that if Sarah helped with the housework, they could stay. There was a small problem, though. The house was filled with wounded German soldiers that the woman was forced to care for. But no matter, Sarah spoke fluent German, and the woman gave her a headscarf and a dress to wear, and she was able to work in the house undisturbed by the German soldiers. In any case, they were probably too injured to have posed any harm to her. Just a few days later, there was a commotion at the door. A troop of Russian soldiers had arrived. Seeing the Germans, they started shooting everywhere, nearly missing Sarah and Lily. They yelled out, "Ivre, we are Jews," in Russian, but these soldiers seemed not to understand. Luckily, their captain was Jewish and he understood. He ordered the men to stop shooting immediately before any of the women were hurt. The Russian captain was kind to Sarah and Lily and wanted to get them out of harm's way. He understood that if they stayed where they were, they might not be safe from all the turmoil with the advance of the Russians. He brought them to a hospital controlled by Russians in Bromberg, Poland, also called Bydgoszcz, I think it's pronounced. There they stayed with regaining their strength for several months. They were like skeletons, but my mother said even in their weakened state, they still worked in the hospital. They always wanted to earn their keep. They took nothing for granted. And my mother told me that they would roll bandages and even, give some kind of medical massages to the other, patients. So they stayed there until April. Conditions were stabilizing. The Russians controlled the area. And they were now strong enough to make their way back to their hometown of Borsato, which they wanted to do to see who was still alive because they had no idea. They were separated from the men at the onset. They didn't know if their brothers or father was still alive. So it was a very long, arduous journey. The trains were on no particular schedule, but they finally did make it home. And this map shows the extent of their journeys from Borsato, their hometown, to the ghetto in Vyshudasut, to Auschwitz, to Stutthof. Bromberg is not on the map, but it would be over here where the cursor is, and back home again. So they got home to their house. Their house was filled with other Jewish survivors, so they knew that some people from the town had indeed survived. So a few days later, miraculously, who shows up but their father? He had survived 3 different concentration camps, but he was okay. Next to return home was brother Joseph. And last but not least, Bill returned. He was sick with typhus and he was recuperating in a hospital after liberation. He finally made his way home. So her father and 3 of her siblings had survived against all odds. But unfortunately, their grandfather, mother, and 2 younger siblings could not be part of their joyful reunion. After the war, the family was anxious to get on with living. These were resilient people. My grandfather remarried a woman that he knew from before the war who also lost her spouse to the Nazis. Sarah married her childhood sweetheart who survived the war. He was actually fighting in the Russian army. Joseph found himself a wife and got married too. My grandfather, Aunt Sarah, and Uncle Joseph eventually immigrated to Israel with their new spouses. My mother would meet my father when she went to his store in Sighet to buy leather goods for her father's newly reopened general store. She chose this particular store because her cousin's husband was a co-owner with my father. As it happened, the first few times my mother went to the store to buy goods, my father wasn't there. He was out on buying trips. So she dealt with her mother's cousin, her cousin's husband, Eli. So one day my father was looking at the books and he complained to his partner, Eli, who is this Lilly Davidowitz that's running up all these large bills on credit? We have such a high inflation rate that the money is almost worthless now. So Eli looked at him very slyly and said, oh, wait until you see this Lilly. I guarantee you're going to forget all about the debts. Matter of fact, she'll be here this afternoon. You'll see. So sure enough, that afternoon, my mother went to the store, met my father, and it was love at first sight. And 3 months later, they were married. Now, Bill was living in US-occupied Munich. He was making a good living dealing with black market goods. My parents decided they would join him there. Eventually, they all hoped to go to the United States. My father had an uncle there in the Bronx who had immigrated before the war. Now, while they were in Germany, the Allied occupation imposed a rule that lodging must be provided to refugees if the family had a room to spare. My parents were sent to an older couple's home. They tried to discourage my parents from moving in. Of course, they were reluctant to share their space with this young Jewish couple. And they even said, oh, we were members of the Nazi Party. They did everything they could to discourage them. But my parents had no place to live, and so they moved in. As it happened, they were able to get along quite amicably. My mother actually used to supply them with cigarettes, coffee, and chocolate. And my mother had such a big heart, she felt sorry for them because they had suffered losses in the war. And my mother would say, Germans are people too. They lost people too during the war. And that's the kind of woman my mother was. She just had a big heart. It was hard for her to hold any hatred or animosity in her heart, despite everything she went through. So this couple was so enamored of my mother that they took this picture before my parents finally moved to the United States in 1951. They finally got their papers. And they took this picture to remember my parents by, because they had gotten close to them over the years. And this is the photo, my mother and Professor Wind and his wife in Munich. Now, when my parents passed away, I went through a lot of their paperwork and I came across this passport that my mother used when they were living in Germany. She used it to travel to visit the rest of her family in Israel. And I was really struck all over again when I saw this passport of the extent of the losses in my mother's life, the loss of her family, her home, her country. She had a passport for a stateless person. And regardless of all of that, I look at her photo. She's beautiful. She's determined. She's full of life and vivacious. And she was just incredibly resilient and brave. Very proud of her. So my parents finally landed in New York in 1951. I was born in 1956. This is a picture of my mother and myself when we went for a visit to Israel. My parents always made it a point, no matter how, they didn't have much money, but they always made it a point whenever it was at all possible to either go to Israel, and sometimes we had visitors from Israel, but we made a few trips to Israel over the years, and this was one of them in this picture. And we were all very close. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned it, but my Uncle Bill moved also to the Bronx shortly after my parents did. And we always lived together. He married my Aunt Terry. I have 3 cousins. I'm an only child, but I was very close with my cousins. And from the Bronx to Paramus, we always kind of moved together. We always remained very, very close. And as I said, as close as possible to the family in Israel. And here's a picture of my Aunt Sarah on the left, my Uncle Bill in the middle, my mother on the right. This was taken in Monticello in the Catskills sometime in the 1960s when Sarah came to visit. Now, Sarah spoke many languages, but English really wasn't one of them. So we couldn't communicate that well, but it didn't matter because she just had this warmth about her, just like my mother did. She was like a second mother to me. I just absolutely adored her. Just a beautiful, beautiful woman. So anyway, we spent a lot of good years living in the Bronx and Paramus, New Jersey. But one day when I was 16, my mother got a letter from Israel with some really devastating news. Her sister Sarah was very sick with cancer. My mother decided suddenly we had to move to Israel so she could help take care of Sarah. So we left everything, home, school, my friends, family, for life in a new country. I was pretty anxious about this move. I didn't know what to expect. I really didn't speak any Hebrew. But I don't recall expressing these concerns to my parents because I just saw how broken up my mother was, and I didn't want to cause her any more pain. And so we moved to Israel. And, very sadly, Sarah had saved my mother's life, but my mother obviously couldn't do the same. And Sarah passed away not long after we got there. And my grandfather passed away about a year after that. So we spent a total of 2 years living in Israel. And to celebrate my high school graduation, my parents and I took a summer vacation back to New Jersey to see Aunt Terry, Uncle Bill, and the cousins. I was only told after we got there that my parents decided they wouldn't be moving back to Israel. I hadn't said a proper goodbye to my friends in Israel, thinking I was going to see them in September. But my parents found it too difficult to adjust to a new life and culture in Israel, and they found they had less reason to stay there without Sarah and my grandfather. So after the difficult years of living in Israel, they decided to move back to the US. And again, I was concerned with causing them any further suffering. So I went along with these two major moves, and I never really voiced a complaint or concern to my parents about it. And I think that's very typical of second generation survivors. Even though my mother was, so strong and full of life and joyful, deep down inside, there was a fragility about her and my father as well. So I think we tend to protect our parents a little bit, and that's what I was doing. So my mother never regretted the move to Israel. Sarah was more than a sister to Lilly. She was a role model and her savior. From Sarah, Lilly learned important life lessons that were passed along to me. The lesson that sacrifices can be endured when there is love. The lesson never to give up hope in the face of unimaginable odds. The lesson that in this world you can face anything if you have someone to lean on. My mom lived life to the fullest. She would say, don't take anything for granted. Each day is a special one. She had no time to engage in petty fights. She never held a grudge and was the peacemaker in the family. She would look hard and try and find the positive in everyone. She had no enemies, only friends. January 21st was the 10th anniversary of my mother's passing, but her spirit is still very much with me. And indeed, each day that I got to spend with her was indeed a very special one. So thank you, everyone, for listening to my mother's story. I'm really honored to have had your attention. You honor me and honor her memory by listening to this story, and honor the memory of Holocaust victims and survivors. So thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. What a remarkable, absolutely a remarkable story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. And now I will click on